of the new lyricism of his time. Though his prayers did indeed bear the imprint of the troubadours, he never attempted to make a mosaic, to paint, or to draw. Nor is there any record of his writing or directing a mystery play, or even putting on the plainest of one-actors. But he understood the importance of gesture, of corporeal expression that speaks beyond words. And so he was able to do something that would profoundly affect both plastic and performance arts, that took the new lyrical sensibility and combined it with a barely born ocular sensibility, and that brought both to a fruition never before dreamed. In the generation after Francis, the most notable Franciscan was the Italian master Bonaventure, a contentiously conservative figure at the University of Paris, who, as general of the order, attempted unsuccessfully to prevent Roger Bacon from publishing his discoveries. He also, after collecting many eyewitness accounts, wrote a biography of Francis, an account full of marvels, not all of which we need take literally. It contains, however, a particularly instructive narrative of the great gesturer at Christmas time. Now 3 years before his death, it befell that he was minded at the town of Greccio to celebrate the memory of the birth of child Jesus, with all the added solemnity that he might, for the kindling of devotion. But this might not seem an innovation. He sought and obtained license from the supreme pontiff, and then made ready a manger, and bade hay, together with an ox and an ass, be brought unto the place. The brethren were called together, the folk assembled, the wood echoed with their voices, and that august night was made radiant and solemn with many bright lights, and with tuneful and sonorous praises. The man of God, filled with tender love, stood before the manger, bathed in tears and overflowing with joy. Solemn masses were celebrated over the manger, Francis, the Levite of Christ, chanting the holy gospel. Then he preached unto the folk standing round the birth of the King in poverty, calling him, when he wished to name him, the child of Bethlehem, by reason of his tender love for him. A certain knight, valorous and true, Messer John of Greccio, who for the love of Christ had left the secular army, and was bound by closest friendship unto the man of God, declared that he beheld a little child right there to see sleeping in that manger, who seemed awakened from sleep when the Blessed Father Francis embraced him in both arms. If this translation gives some sense of Bonaventure's credulous piety and of his tendency to wrap the founder of his order in unearthly light, it also has about it the sort of emotional ambience we still seek out at Christmas. There is no reason to doubt that John of Greccio gave this narrative to Bonaventure, though we needn't believe that the wooden babe in the manger came alive at Francis's touch, only that John, in the unearthly illumination of Christmas night, believed that was what he saw. There is some slight evidence that Italians before Francis may have been known to fashion a wooden bambino to lay before the altar at the midnight Christ Mass. But leading an ox and an ass into the sanctuary was an original idea. With it began the tradition of the presepio, or Christmas creche, the practice of arranging a tableau of live creatures, both animal and human, near the Christmas altar, to portray the story of the first Christmas night. Eventually, the tradition divided in two, giving us a creche of statues on display throughout the Christmas season, and a pageant of live actors, usually children, to dramatize the Christmas story separately, but leave it to Francis to lead large live animals into the church, and even to insist on real hay. Bonaventure is intent on telling us many things. That Francis first sought the Pope's permission for his innovation, most unlikely. That Francis acted as deacon, chanting the gospel of Christmas and giving a tender sermon, most likely. And that all was radiant and solemn, tuneful and sonorous, more or less, no doubt. but the biographer seems not to have noticed the import of what Francis was doing. Francis must have asked himself several questions before directing this wonderfully excessive display. What did the stable look like? What was it like to give birth to a child there betwixt an ox and a silly poor ass? What did the baby look like? What did the baby feel? As Francis had told his friend John, I wish to make a memorial of that child who was born in Bethlehem, and as far as is possible, behold with bodily eyes the hardships of his infant state, lying on hay in a manger with the ox and the ass standing by. Though Bonaventure fails to name them, it's possible, even likely, that Francis on this or another occasion brought in a nursing mother to play Mary, and a man to play Joseph, perhaps children to play angels. Eventually, of course, there would be shepherds, wise men and their train, and a whole menagerie that included sheep, a cock, and even camels. This archetypal tableau, presented to the people of Greccio in the Vale of Rieti on Christmas night in the year 1223, announced the end of the icon and the beginning of realism. No more would the visual artist make a kind of Christian idol to be bowed before and held in awe. No more would travelling companies offer merely symbolic dramas with actors brought on stage to illustrate virtues and vices, as in the medieval drama Everyman, who is never any particular man. Of course, such symbolic dramas continued to be staged. Everyman itself is later than Francis, but Francis opened up new possibilities. The wholly new question to be asked was historical, emotional, particular, and human. What would it have been like to be there? This question, never asked before, was still being asked at the end of the Second World War by men like Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini, as they set aside fancy dress filmmaking and artificial indoor sets and went out to the broken streets, peeling stairwells, pitted walls, and piteous disorder of Rome to direct the first films of Italian neorealism, gathering ordinary people, non-actors, to play many parts. In the town of Greccio, on Christmas night in 1223, were born the arts as we still know them. The story is told by Giorgio Vasari, the 16th century Florentine artist and architect, whose Lives of Other Artists is more famous than any of his surviving paintings and buildings. One day, probably in the late 1270s, a man was riding from Florence to Vespignano. He was Cimabue, the greatest artist of his day, whose tender brushstrokes had already departed, if a little tentatively, from the still dominant Greek tradition. Cimabue passed a field where the boy of 10 was watching sheep for his father. But this boy was no mere